In an industry driven by rapid technological advances, bigger budgets, and often bloated sequels, it's ironic how so many modern titles struggle to capture the timeless appeal of their predecessors. Few franchises exemplify this paradox more than Dead Rising. In 2006, Dead Rising crashed onto the gaming scene, offering players a sandbox of chaos, bizarre weapon options, and a deeply satisfying timer mechanic that put constant pressure on the player's decisions. Yet, as the series progressed, each new entry seemed to move further away from what made the original so special. Dead Rising was a wild experiment in game design, and the developers understood that truly good design doesn't age. Capcom had stumbled upon a perfect balance of frantic action, morbid humor, and pressure-driven decision-making that made players think on their feet. But as the series grew, it lost its focus, and somewhere along the way, the core formula started to unravel. By the time Dead Rising 4 rolled around in 2016, the franchise had not only lost its footing, but seemed completely disconnected from its origins. It's a stark reminder that when developers abandon the essence of what made their games great in the first place, even a beloved series can stumble. This video takes a deep dive into each of the major entries into the Dead Rising series, analyzing what worked in the early games, why later releases fell short, and how Capcom returned to the franchise's roots with the Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. By revisiting each title, we can not only appreciate how the series evolved, but also understand why the original game's design philosophy, grounded in urgency, creativity, and charm, remains as relevant today as it was nearly 2 decades ago. When Dead Rising launched in 2006, it acted equally as a game and a statement to the industry at large. At a time when gaming was edging towards gritty aesthetics, photorealism, and streamlined mechanics, Capcom decided to go in a radically different direction, creating a chaotic open-world sandbox that blurred the line between horror and absurdity. The decision was risky, but in hindsight, it was nothing short of visionary. The release of Dead Rising not only revitalized the zombie genre as a whole, but also set a new standard for open-world game design and creativity in combat systems. From a development standpoint, Dead Rising represented a massive leap forward for Capcom. The game was one of the first to fully exploit the processing power of the Xbox 360, enabling it to render hundreds of zombies on screen simultaneously without overwhelming the system, a feat that was very impressive for its time. The lead designer, Keiji Inafune, had a vision of creating an open-world zombie game that wasn't constrained by linear storytelling or traditional survival horror mechanics. While games like Resident Evil kept players on rails, Dead Rising gave players the freedom to experiment, explore, and engage with the game world in a way that felt liberating. The mall setting was a stroke of genius, and on the surface, it seemed like a simple homage to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, but it quickly became clear that the Willamette Parkview Mall was a character in and of itself. Every corner of the mall was packed with items, stores, and secrets, offering players an enormous playground filled with possibilities. The variety of stores, ranging from hardware shops to clothing boutiques and everything in between, gave players the opportunity to choose from a seemingly infinite number of weapons, from the brutally effective to the refreshingly ridiculous. How many games at the time gave you the chance to mow down zombies with a lawnmower or pummel them with a giant teddy bear? This open-ended design wasn't just for laughs, though. It empowered players to experiment. No two playthroughs were exactly the same thanks to the sheer variety of tools at your disposal and the unpredictable nature of the game's enemies. It would be easy to dismiss the zombies in Dead Rising as mindless cannon fodder, but the mechanics and design of the undead as well as the survivors was a major achievement. The zombies in Dead Rising were not particularly fast or smart, but what they lacked in agility they made up for in sheer numbers. Capcom made a deliberate design choice to overwhelm the player through density rather than intelligence, creating situations where even the slow-moving enemies could become lethal if you didn't plan your routes carefully. This created constant tension. While you could theoretically fight your way through the horde, it was often smarter to strategize and choose when to engage or when to evade. The survivors, on the other hand, presented a whole different challenge. AI companions in games have a notorious reputation for being difficult to manage, and Dead Rising was certainly no exception. Some players found the survivor AI frustrating, as they would often get stuck or fail to follow directions. But in a strange way, I believe this unpredictability added to the game's charm. Much like myself, these survivors were flawed, panicked, and prone to making bad decisions. It was up to the player to adapt and work around their shortcomings, making their rescue all the more rewarding. If there's one aspect of Dead Rising that remains divisive to this day, it's the save system. Unlike modern games that autosave at every turn, Dead Rising forced players to save manually by finding bathrooms scattered around the mall. It was a design choice that echoed older, more punishing games where every save felt like a calculated risk. On one hand, it added a layer of tension. Die without saving and you could lose progress. On the other, this could understandably be a source of immense frustration, especially for players who weren't accustomed to this level of difficulty. The save system was one of the game's boldest decisions. It forced me to think about every encounter carefully. Should I risk exploring a new area before saving, or should I backtrack to a rest room and lock in my progress? That sense of risk versus reward kept me on edge throughout my playthrough, heightening the overall experience. It wasn't for everyone, but it was undeniably a core part of what made Dead Rising memorable for myself and many other players. This mechanic mirrored the broader philosophy of the game. You had to make choices, and you had to live with the consequences. Equally divisive and arguably more defining was Dead Rising's use of timed missions. The 72-hour clock was the heartbeat of the game, counting down relentlessly as players scrambled to complete main story objectives, side quests, and rescue missions. Not everyone appreciated the pressure, though. In an era where open-world games were increasingly becoming more sprawling, leisurely affairs, Dead Rising took the opposite route. Here, time was a limited resource, and every decision felt weighty. The game refused to let you save everyone, uncover every secret, or complete every mission in one go, and that was the point. The tight time constraints encouraged multiple playthroughs, each with different strategies and priorities. In one playthrough, I might focus on rescuing as many survivors as possible, sacrificing story progression. And in another, I'd let the survivors fend for themselves, focusing more on the conspiracy behind the outbreak. Each playthrough felt different, and each failure taught me something new. The influence of Dead Rising extended far beyond its gameplay innovations. At the time of its release, zombie media was enjoying a resurgence in popular culture, with films like 28 Days Later and Shaun of the Dead bringing the genre back to life. But in the gaming world, zombies had become somewhat stagnant. Resident Evil was still a dominant force, but it was moving away from slow, shambling hordes in favor of more action-oriented, human-like threats. Dead Rising, in contrast, embraced the classic Romero-style zombie apocalypse in a way that felt both nostalgic and new. Its success helped pave the way for the flood of zombie games that would follow in the next decade. Games like Left 4 Dead, Dying Light, and even the Walking Dead franchise owe some of their popularity to Dead Rising's reimagining of the zombie apocalypse as this chaotic, player-driven experience. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about how you survived, and the game made sure you did it in style, even if that style involved wearing some absurd costumes while riding a skateboard through a sea of the undead. Looking back at Dead Rising, it's clear why this game still holds a special place in the hearts of many. It didn't just present players with a sandbox, it gave them one filled with toys and dared them to see how far they could push the limits. The marriage of creativity, time pressure, and improvisation was a formula that Capcom captured almost perfectly on its first try, and that's why it's frustrating to see how later entries drifted from these roots. When Dead Rising 2 arrived in 2010, it was met with both anticipation and skepticism. The original game had set a high bar, and with a new development team at the helm, Blue Castle Games, later known as Capcom Vancouver, fans were unsure if the sequel would live up to the chaos and creativity that made the first game such a classic. However, Dead Rising 2 quickly established itself as not only a worthy successor, but also an ambitious evolution of the series. By retaining the core elements of the original, like the improvisational combat and time-sensitive missions, while adding new mechanics including the combo weapon system and cooperative play, Dead Rising 2 offered players a fresh but familiar experience. At the heart of Dead Rising 2 is Chuck Green, a motocross champion whose life has been upended by the zombie apocalypse. Unlike Frank West, whose motivations in the first game were largely self-serving, primarily driven by his desire to uncover a scoop and cement his career, Chuck's motivation is more personal. His daughter, Katie, has been infected with the zombie virus, and Chuck must provide her with regular doses of Zombrex, a medication that temporarily halts the transformation. This constant need to secure Zombrex not only creates a personal narrative hook, but also introduces a gameplay mechanic that reinforces the game's ever-present sense of urgency. Chuck's relationship with Katie adds an emotional depth that the first game lacked. While Dead Rising was, at its core, a satire of consumer culture and a playground of over-the-top violence, Dead Rising 2 injected a more human element into the proceedings. Chuck's desperation to protect his daughter in the face of overwhelming odds made the stakes feel higher. That said, the shift from Frank West to Chuck Green wasn't universally embraced. Frank's sardonic wit and everyman persona had made him an iconic character, and some fans understandably missed him. Chuck was quieter, more reserved, and his motivations were driven less by personal goals and more by his love for his daughter. In many ways, Chuck was a more relatable protagonist, but he lacked some of the charm that had made Frank such a memorable figure. For those who enjoyed Frank's dry humor and snappy one-liners, Chuck's more serious demeanor may have felt like a step back. But for others, the more grounded and emotionally driven narrative was a welcome change. The setting of Dead Rising 2, Fortune City, was an inspired choice. Modeled after Las Vegas, Fortune City was a sprawling, garish playground that contrasted starkly with the claustrophobic confines of the Willamette Parkview Mall from the first game. While the mall in Dead Rising felt intimate with its compact corridors and densely packed stores, Fortune City was vast, with wide open spaces, neon-lit streets, and a variety of environments that ranged from high-end casinos to rundown maintenance areas. This gave players a greater sense of freedom and allowed for more creative ways to engage with the environment. One of the most compelling aspects of Fortune City was its integration of gambling and minigames, which fit perfectly with the Vegas theme. In between mowing down zombies, players could try their luck at slot machines, play poker, or even participate in zombie-themed game shows. These distractions were more than just novelties, they were integral to the game's resource management system. The money earned from gambling could be used to buy weapons, Zombrex for Katie, or even unlock special in-game bonuses. This introduced a strategic element to the sandbox. Players had to decide whether to invest their time in earning cash or focus on progressing the main story. Exploring Fortune City felt like a natural evolution of the open-world design introduced in the first game. The environments were more varied, offering players a wide range of locations to explore, each with its own unique layout and set of challenges. The casinos were brightly lit and filled with slot machines and roulette tables that could be repurposed as weapons. The shopping plazas offered countless items that could be turned into deadly tools, from golf clubs to mannequins. Meanwhile, the maintenance tunnels and backrooms were dark, grimy, and crawling with zombies, providing a more traditional horror vibe. This variety kept the game feeling fresh throughout its lengthy runtime and encouraged players to experiment with different strategies and weapons. While the original Dead Rising allowed players to use everyday objects as weapons, Dead Rising 2 took this concept to the next level with the introduction of combo weapons. This new system allowed players to combine two weapons to create something entirely new, and often hilariously deadly. The idea of duct taping chainsaws to paddles and creating the paddle saw, or turning a giant teddy bear into a Rambo lookalike, was exactly the kind of creativity that made Dead Rising unique. What made the combo weapon system so engaging was the way it encouraged exploration and experimentation. Scattered throughout Fortune City, there were maintenance rooms where players could combine the items they found in the environment. Blueprints for new weapons were also hidden in various locations, rewarding players who took the time to explore every nook and cranny. Once a new combo weapon was created, it was permanently added to the player's list of recipes. The combo weapons weren't just for show either, they were essential for survival. As the zombie hordes grew larger and more dangerous, especially in the later stages of the game, having the right weapons at your disposal became critical. Some of the combo weapons, like the Blambo, a bow with dynamite attached to the arrows, was particularly useful for crowd control, while others like the paddle saw were designed for close quarters carnage. This system of creative weapon crafting became a defining feature of the series and helped cement Dead Rising 2 as more than just a retread of the original. A hallmark of the Dead Rising franchise is its psychopath boss battles. Insane, often grotesque human characters who have snapped under the pressure of the zombie apocalypse. Dead Rising 2 continued this tradition with a colorful and disturbing cast of characters. These psychopaths were more than just boss fights, they were emblematic of the game's dark humor and critique of human nature. From the psychotic chef who wanted to serve Chuck as his next dish, to a flamethrower-wielding clothing store mascot, the psychopaths each had their own twisted backstory and personality. While some of these encounters were genuinely unsettling, they were often framed in a way that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. The game balanced its horror elements with moments of black comedy, ensuring that even when things got dark, there was always a layer of satire just below the surface. What made the psychopath fights particularly memorable was the way they challenged players. Unlike regular zombies, which could be dealt with by using brute force, the psychopaths required a more strategic approach. Each one had its own set of attacks and weaknesses, and figuring out the puzzle of how to defeat them was part of what made these fights so satisfying. These boss battles were some of the most tense and rewarding moments of the game, offering a break from the zombie killing action and forcing players to adapt to new threats. One of the biggest innovations in Dead Rising 2 was the introduction of online multiplayer, particularly the cooperative mode. In the original Dead Rising, players were isolated in their fight against the zombie hordes, but Dead Rising 2 allowed for a second player to join in on the fun. This addition wasn't just a gimmick, it fundamentally changed the way the game could be experienced. In co-op, two players could team up to complete missions, fight psychopaths, and rescue survivors together. The sandbox nature of the game made this mode especially entertaining, as players could experiment with combo weapons and strategies together, often leading to chaotic and hilarious outcomes. The co-op mode also made the game feel less daunting, as players could rely on each other for backup during particularly difficult missions. However, the introduction of co-op wasn't without its challenges. The game's time-sensitive missions could sometimes feel more stressful when trying to coordinate with another player. Additionally, only the host player would see story progression, which meant that the second player was more of a guest in the narrative, unable to save their progress independently. Despite these minor drawbacks, co-op added significant replay value to the game and became a fan-favorite feature of the series moving forward. In addition to co-op, Dead Rising 2 also introduced a competitive multiplayer mode called Terror is Reality. In this mode, players participated in zombie-themed game shows, competing against each other in a series of minigames. While this mode didn't have the depth or staying power of the main game, it was still a fun distraction that leaned into the game's sense of humor and added another layer of variety to the overall package. The timed mission structure of the first Dead Rising returned in the sequel, and once again it was a polarizing feature for newcomers. For some players, the constant pressure of the ticking clock added a level of tension and excitement that made every decision feel meaningful. For others, the time limit was a source of frustration, especially in a game that encouraged exploration and experimentation, arguably even more than the original title did. In Dead Rising 2, the time-sensitive nature of the missions was further complicated by the need to administer Zombrex to Katie every 24 in-game hours. This added another layer of strategy to the game. Players had to balance their need to explore and complete missions with the necessity of not just finding Zombrex to keep Katie alive, but getting back to the security room in time to give it to her. It created a rhythm to the gameplay that was both rewarding and stressful, as players had to constantly plan ahead and prioritize their actions. This system, while demanding, was also one of the game's strengths. It once again forced players to make tough choices, knowing that they couldn't do everything in one playthrough. The time limit, now an established mechanic in the franchise, continued to encourage replaying the game. The sense of urgency combined with the open-world freedom created a unique tension that few other games at the time could replicate, and one that future entries in the series would struggle to as well. While Dead Rising 2 successfully expanded on the foundation laid by the first game, it also introduced changes that altered the tone and experience of the series. The introduction of Chuck Green as a more serious and emotionally driven protagonist was a notable shift from Frank West's irreverent, self-serving attitude. This gave the game a different emotional core, but it also made it feel less like a satire of consumer culture like the original game had been. Additionally, the move from the enclosed, claustrophobic setting of the mall to wide-open spaces in Fortune City changed the way the game felt. The sense of isolation that permeated the original Dead Rising was replaced with a more chaotic, frenetic atmosphere. While this was exciting in its own right, some fans of the original missed the tighter focus and atmosphere of the mall. With that said, Dead Rising 2 retained the series' core identity, that being improvisational combat, dark humor, and time-sensitive missions. The combo weapon system, expanded environments, and introduction of co-op added enough new elements to keep the series fresh without losing what made the original great. It was a careful balancing act, and for the most part, Dead Rising 2 succeeded in maintaining that balance. While Dead Rising 2 was a full-fledged sequel that built on the mechanics of the original, Capcom's approach to DLC with Case Zero and Case West added an important layer to the franchise's narrative. These expansions weren't just minor add-ons or cosmetic updates. They provided important story content that connected key dots within the Dead Rising timeline, giving players more insight into the characters and world. These downloadable standalone chapters reflected Capcom's evolving approach to episodic content, showing the potential of smaller, self-contained experiences that could enhance the main game without overwhelming the player. Both Case Zero and Case West succeeded in delivering gameplay that retained the core spirit of Dead Rising while experimenting with new approaches to storytelling and mechanics. Each of them, however, served a different purpose in the larger narrative arc, providing both a prequel and an epilogue to Dead Rising 2. Case Zero, released in 2010 as a prologue to Dead Rising 2, wasn't just a typical piece of DLC. It was an innovative experiment in episodic content that stood on its own. Designed as a standalone, albeit shorter game release, Case Zero introduced players to Chuck Green and his daughter Katie in a smaller, more contained environment. Set in the small town of Still Creek, Nevada, Case Zero gave players their first taste of Dead Rising 2's mechanics while establishing the emotional stakes for Chuck's character. At its core, Case Zero was a tutorial for Dead Rising 2, giving players a chance to familiarize themselves with the new combo weapon system and timed mission structure. However, it was far more than just a technical showcase. The DLC was an excellent example of how to introduce new players to the series while still providing meaningful content for longtime fans. By placing Chuck in a desperate situation, stranded in a zombie-infested town with only a few hours to find Zombrex for Katie, the game immediately communicated the emotional core of Dead Rising 2. Chuck wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting to keep his daughter alive, and that personal motivation made the gameplay all the more intense. The small scale of Still Creek was one of Case Zero's strengths. Unlike the sprawling Fortune City, Still Creek was a compact environment, more reminiscent of the Willamette Parkview Mall from the first Dead Rising. This allowed for tighter, more focused gameplay that encouraged exploration and experimentation within a limited space. The town was filled with hidden weapons, survivors to rescue, and blueprints for combo weapons, all of which could be carried over to the main game once Dead Rising 2 was released. This continuity between the DLC and full game was a genius design choice that rewarded players for investing time in the prequel. In many ways, Case Zero felt like a return to the roots of Dead Rising. with its smaller, more intimate setting and limited resources. Players had to be strategic in how they approached each encounter, using the environment to their advantage and managing their time carefully. The clock was once again ticking, and players had to make tough decisions about which survivors to save and how to best allocate their time. This sense of urgency and limited scope made Case Zero a tense and engaging experience. The success of Case Zero also demonstrated the potential of episodic content in the Dead Rising franchise. As a standalone game priced at a fraction of the cost of a full release, it allowed players to get a taste of the larger game without making a full commitment. For new players, it was an accessible entry point into the series, while veterans appreciated the additional backstory and gameplay leading up to Dead Rising 2. However, despite its success as a prequel, Case Zero wasn't without issues. The smaller scale meant that the gameplay, while tight, lacked the variety and depth of the main game. Additionally, the story, while emotionally charged, was fairly simple and didn't offer much in terms of plot twists or character development beyond the basic setup for Dead Rising 2. With that said, as a piece of DLC, Case Zero was a success, offering a meaningful prologue that enhanced the larger narrative without overstaying its welcome. While Case Zero acted as a prequel to Dead Rising 2, Case West gave a post-game epilogue that reunited fans with the original hero of the series, Frank West. This DLC bridged the gap between Dead Rising 2 and the original Dead Rising, offering players a chance to see what happened to Frank in the aftermath of the first game. Set in the Phenotrans facility, an evil pharmaceutical corporation responsible for much of the zombie outbreak, Case West expanded on the conspiracy narrative that had been hinted at throughout the main game. The return of Frank West was a major selling point for Case West, as fans had been clamoring to see more of the iconic photojournalist since his absence in Dead Rising 2. Teaming up with Chuck Green in a buddy cop-style partnership, Frank brought his trademark humor and cynicism to the DLC, providing a nice contrast to Chuck's more serious demeanor. The dynamic between these two was one of the highlights of Case West, with their banter adding levity to the darker aspects of the story. Speaking of which, the story of Case West was more plot-driven than Case Zero, focusing on the duo's investigation into the shady dealings of Phenotrans. Unlike the open-ended sandbox nature of Dead Rising 2, Case West had a more linear structure, with players progressing through the Phenotrans facility in a series of interconnected missions. While this greatly reduced the freedom that players had come to expect from the series, it also allowed for a more focused narrative. The DLC provided important revelations about the zombie outbreak and the role of Phenotrans in spreading the virus, setting the stage for future entries in the series. Gameplay-wise, Case West stuck closely to the formula established by Dead Rising 2, with players using combo weapons to fight off waves of zombies while rescuing survivors and uncovering clues. However, the addition of Frank West brought back a fan-favorite mechanic that had been missing from Dead Rising 2: photography. Just as in the original game, players could take pictures of their surroundings with points awarded based on the content of the photos. This added an extra layer of interactivity to the gameplay, encouraging players to document the carnage while investigating the secrets of Phenotrans. One of the biggest additions in Case West was the ability to play the entire campaign in co-op mode, with one player controlling Chuck and the other controlling Frank. This cooperative element allowed players to work together to take down psychopaths, rescue survivors, and complete objectives. The dynamic between Chuck and Frank made the co-op experience especially enjoyable, as each character brought their own strengths and abilities to the table. Despite its strengths, Case West wasn't without its flaws. The more linear structure, while great for storytelling, limited the freedom that had defined the main games. The setting was also less interesting than Fortune City or the Willamette Mall, with the sterile industrial environment of the Phenotrans facility feeling more repetitive and less vibrant than the series' usual colorful, chaotic locales. Additionally, the story, while interesting, felt somewhat rushed, with several plot points and character arcs left unresolved by the time the credits rolled. However, Case West succeeded in bringing closure to Chuck Green's story while setting up future developments for Frank West. It provided a satisfying conclusion to Dead Rising 2's narrative while offering fans a glimpse of what was to come in the future. And much like Case Zero, it demonstrated how episodic content could be used effectively to expand the world of Dead Rising without the need for a full sequel. Both Case Zero and Case West showed that episodic content could be more than just filler or minor updates to the main game. By creating standalone chapters that both expanded the narrative and allowed for more focused gameplay experiences, Capcom found a way to add value to Dead Rising without overwhelming players with unnecessary content. This is a lesson they would soon forget while working on future installments. Both expansions were well received for their ability to provide meaningful additions to the storyline while also serving as bite-sized, self-contained adventures that could be enjoyed by newcomers and veterans alike. The success of these DLC chapters also paved the way for future episodic content within the series and beyond, showing that smaller, more focused experiences could coexist alongside full-length games. For Dead Rising, this model worked well because it allowed Capcom to explore different aspects of the game world and its characters without the need for another massive release. The ability to dip in and out of these mini-adventures kept the world of Dead Rising alive between major installments, offering fans something to tide them over while also adding depth to the series' overarching narrative. When Dead Rising 3 was released in 2013, it was the franchise's first foray into the next generation of consoles, debuting on the Xbox One. The game represented a significant technological leap from its predecessors, delivering a much larger world and higher graphical fidelity. It was clear from the outset that Dead Rising 3 aimed to be more ambitious, with Capcom Vancouver building a vast, citywide sandbox for players to explore. Yet, this came with a cost. In expanding the scope of the game and shifting the tone towards realism, Dead Rising 3 lost much of the zany charm, satirical humor, and tight-knit gameplay systems that had defined the franchise thus far. One of the most noticeable changes in Dead Rising 3 was the introduction of a new protagonist, Nick Ramos. Unlike the cocky, self-serving Frank West from the original Dead Rising or the emotionally driven Chuck Green from Dead Rising 2, Nick was a quieter, more introspective character. His background as an orphan and mechanic didn't carry the same level of emotional weight as Chuck's quest to save his daughter from the zombie infection, nor did it have the same immediate appeal as Frank's opportunistic and cynical attitude. While Nick's journey was still engaging, it lacked the strong personal stakes that had made both Chuck and Frank's stories resonate with players. Nick's story is set against the backdrop of Los Perdidos, a fictional Californian city overrun by zombies. His main motivation is survival and escape, but as the game progresses, Nick learns that he is immune to the zombie infection and becomes a key figure in uncovering a larger conspiracy involving the military and Phenotrans. While this narrative twist added some intrigue, it felt disconnected from Nick's character. He wasn't a natural hero or a particularly memorable figure. Instead, he was more of a reactive protagonist, swept up in the events beyond his control. This shift in character tone contributed to a broader change in the overall feel of Dead Rising 3. In earlier games, the protagonists were more clearly defined, each with a distinct personality that shaped the story's direction. Frank West's ego-driven antics and Chuck Green's need to protect his daughter were central to their respective games' emotional core. Nick, by contrast, felt more like a blank slate, and as a result, the narrative didn't hit as hard emotionally, leaving players feeling less invested in the journey. Los Perdidos, the sprawling city, based on Los Angeles, was the largest environment ever seen in a Dead Rising game, and it showcased the capabilities of the new Xbox One hardware.
Shoved a VHS player in the back, come on! Three symmetrical cores running at 3.2 gigahertz times 2. 500 megahertz processor, 10 megabytes of embedded RAM. 10 meg. That's 500 million triangles per nanosecond. How many triangles is that?
From the high-rise buildings and industrial districts to the desolate highways, Los Perdidos was a massive, immersive sandbox that allowed players an unprecedented level of freedom to explore and experiment. On a technical level, the city was an impressive achievement. The game could render thousands of zombies on screen at once, though this came at the cost of rather significant slowdowns, especially right at launch before there were any patches released. With that being said, from a purely numbers-based standpoint with regard to the zombie horde, this was a marked improvement from previous games, where the number of enemies on screen was often constrained by the hardware limitations of the Xbox 360. The ability to navigate a massive open-world city teeming with zombies was a thrilling prospect, and Dead Rising 3 did its best to deliver on that promise. However, the larger environment came with drawbacks. In the earlier games, the smaller, more confined settings of the Willamette Parkview Mall and Fortune City created a sense of intimacy and tension. Players had to carefully navigate tight corridors and crowded shops, constantly improvising with whatever weapons they could find. The more expansive streets and open areas of Los Perdidos, while visually impressive, lacked the same level of intensity. Players could often avoid combat simply by driving through the city or running from one objective to the next, and this diminished the need for the creative, up-close combat that had defined the franchise. The increased reliance on vehicles further altered the dynamic of the game. In Dead Rising 3, players could craft combo vehicles, such as the Roller Hog, a deadly combination of a motorcycle and a steamroller, that allowed them to plow through the masses with ease. While these vehicles were fun to use, they made much of the zombie combat feel inconsequential. Where earlier games forced players to engage with the environment and zombies in creative ways, Dead Rising 3 often allowed players to bypass combat altogether by jumping into a car and mowing down hundreds of enemies at once, completely undermining one of the core pillars of the franchise. One of the most divisive aspects of Dead Rising 3 was its tonal shift. While the earlier games had embraced a campy, tongue-in-cheek style, Dead Rising 3 opted for a darker, grittier atmosphere. Gone were the bright neon-lit malls and casinos of the earlier games, replaced by the grimy, desaturated streets of Los Perdidos. The game's color palette reflected this change, with muted grays and browns dominating the visual landscape. The shift in tone extended to the game's storytelling and characters as well. The humor that had been a hallmark of the earlier games was largely absent, replaced by a more serious, survival-focused narrative. While there were still moments of absurdity, players could still dress Nick in outlandish costumes or craft ridiculous combo weapons, the overall tone of the game was far more somber. This change alienated some longtime fans who had felt that the series had lost the satirical edge that had made the earlier games so unique. In particular, the psychopaths, boss characters who had previously been colorful, over-the-top caricatures of societal breakdown, were now portrayed in a much darker, more menacing light. In the earlier games, the psychopaths were often comic relief, exaggerated representations of how people might react to the apocalypse. In Dead Rising 3, however, they were more disturbing and violent, with their humor largely stripped away. This change made the psychopath battles feel more like weak attempts at mimicking the earlier games, rather than properly emulating, or better yet, iterating on, the satirical, grotesque spectacles they had been in the past. While Dead Rising 3 didn't completely abandon its roots, it introduced significant changes to the core gameplay mechanics that altered the player experience. One of the most notable improvements was the behavior of the zombies themselves. The AI was far more advanced than in previous entries, with zombies now reacting more dynamically to the player's actions. There were also newly introduced Special Infected, which had unique behaviors that made them more dangerous than the average zombie. These changes added some welcome variety to the combat, but they also made the game feel more like a run-of-the-mill zombie game, which detracted from the franchise's distinct identity. You have to keep in mind, part of the draw of the earlier titles was the Romero-style zombies. And while I appreciate enemy variety, I would have preferred that variety be spread out across common human enemies or the psychopaths, much like Dead Rising 1 had the Raincoat Cult and Special Forces operatives, all mixed right in with the undead. In addition to the improved AI, Dead Rising 3 expanded the combo weapon system that had been introduced in Dead Rising 2. Players could now craft combo weapons on the fly, provided they had the necessary materials in their inventory. This streamlined the crafting process, making it easier for players to quickly switch between different weapons during combat. However, the ability to create combo weapons on demand also diminished the sense of discovery and resource management that had been a key part of the second entry. In Dead Rising 2, finding the right items to craft a powerful weapon felt rewarding because it required exploration and experimentation. In Dead Rising 3, the crafting system felt more like a convenience, and while it removed some of the friction in the moment-to-moment gameplay, it also made it less satisfying. Another notable addition was the inclusion of combo vehicles, which allowed players to combine different vehicle parts to create monstrous death machines. While these vehicles were fun to use, mowing down hundreds of zombies with a steamroller or firing rockets from a souped-up sports car, they further contributed to the game's overall power fantasy. The challenge of survival, which had been a defining feature of the original game and its sequel, was largely diminished by the sheer destructive power of these combo vehicles. Players no longer had to rely on quick thinking or creative problem-solving to survive. They could simply craft a combo vehicle and plow through the hordes with ease. One area where Dead Rising 3 made meaningful improvements was its co-op mode. Building on the co-op features of Dead Rising 2, the game allowed two players to team up and complete the main campaign together. This time, the second player controlled a character named Dick, who had his own unique abilities and backstory. The addition of a dedicated co-op character made the multiplayer experience feel more integrated into the story rather than an afterthought. Playing through the whole campaign with a friend added a new layer of fun. But this campaign was made even easier by the timer system in Dead Rising 3, which was present truly in name alone. There was now an overabundance of time for players to do as they please, eliminating the sense of urgency that would have normally been present in both single-player and co-op play. This opened the game up to more players, sure, but it came at the cost of the gameplay experience that longtime fans had come to expect. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done, and Capcom Vancouver would continue down this path in Dead Rising 4, but we're not quite at that point in the video just yet. Upon release, Dead Rising 3 received generally positive reviews from critics, who praised the game's expanded open-world design, improved graphics, and co-op features. The game wasn't amazing, but it was seen as a solid launch title for the Xbox One, showcasing the potential of the new hardware and offering a fun, zombie-filled sandbox for players to explore. However, the game's shift in tone and gameplay mechanics felt like a departure from what had made the original Dead Rising games so special. For longtime fans of the series, Dead Rising 3 was a divisive experience. While some appreciated the game's larger scope, others felt that it had lost the charm, humor, and tension that had defined the earlier games. The move towards a more serious, realistic tone alienated fans who had enjoyed the series' campy, satirical edge. And the reduced difficulty and streamlined mechanics also led to complaints that it had become too easy, with players no longer needing to rely on strategy or creativity to survive. Dead Rising 3 marked a turning point for the franchise, having laid the groundwork for even more significant shifts in the series' identity. and these decisions ultimately led to the franchise's decline in quality and popularity. By the time Dead Rising 4 was released in 2016, the Dead Rising franchise had undergone several transformations, but none were as poorly received as this installment. Billed as a return to form, Dead Rising 4 brought back Frank West, the beloved protagonist from the original game, and returned to the iconic setting of Willamette during the holiday season. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect recipe for rekindling the franchise's glory days. However, in an attempt to modernize the series, Capcom made drastic design changes that stripped away many of the elements that made the earlier games so unique. What was intended to be a celebration of the series' legacy ultimately became a cautionary tale about losing sight of what made a franchise special in the first place. The decision to bring Frank West back was one of the most heavily marketed aspects of Dead Rising 4. Fans had long clamored for the return of the wisecracking photojournalist whose wit and charm had made him a fan favorite in the first game. However, the Frank West that players encountered in Dead Rising 4 was not quite the same character they had fallen in love with a decade earlier. Frank had been completely reimagined, both in terms of appearance and personality. Gone was the guy who's covered wars, with the everyman appeal, replaced by a snarkier, more arrogant version who often felt out of place in the game's world. While Frank's return should have been a triumphant moment for the franchise, it instead felt hollow due to the character's drastic change in personality. Frank's sardonic humor had always been a defining trait, but in Dead Rising 4 it was ramped up to the point where it bordered on obnoxious. The game's writing leaned heavily into a more comedic tone, but rather than the dark, satirical humor that had defined the first game, Dead Rising 4's humor often felt forced and out of step with the world around it. The new Frank West came across as a caricature of his former self, and for many fans, this version of Frank was a poor replacement for the character they had grown to love. Capcom also decided to recast Frank West, replacing voice actor TJ Rotolo, who had voiced Frank in the previous games. This change, while minor to some, was jarring for longtime fans. The new voice actor's performance lacked the same grit and charm, further alienating players who had been excited to see Frank return. In a clear attempt to invoke nostalgia, Dead Rising 4 returned players to Willamette, Colorado, the setting of the first game. This time, however, the action took place during the Christmas season, adding a festive and somewhat surreal layer to the zombie carnage. The Willamette Memorial Megaplex, a larger and more modern mall built on the site of the original, served as the main hub of the game, with players able to explore not only the mall but also the surrounding town. While revisiting Willamette offered some fun moments of nostalgia, it also highlighted how much the series had changed. The original Dead Rising was tightly focused on the mall, creating a sense of claustrophobia and urgency as players navigated the packed, chaotic environments. In Dead Rising 4, the Megaplex felt more like a large, sprawling environment without the same sense of tension. The surrounding areas of Willamette, including the residential neighborhoods and industrial zones, expanded the world, but they also diluted the experience, making it feel more like a generic open-world game rather than the focused, frantic survival experiences of days past. The holiday setting did add some charm, though, with the mall and town decorated with Christmas lights, trees, and presents, providing some humorous visual contrast to the zombie outbreak. Yet, even this seasonal touch couldn't mask the fact that this new Willamette lacked personality and the intentionality of the original. The sprawling environment, while large, felt empty, with much of the game world serving as little more than window dressing rather than meaningful interactive spaces. In Dead Rising 4, the timer system was completely removed, allowing players to explore at their leisure without any pressure. On the surface, this change was meant to make the game more accessible to casual players, but it had a profound impact on the overall experience. Without the ticking clock, the game lost much of its tension and challenge. Players no longer had to carefully manage their time or plan routes. Instead, they could freely roam the world, completing missions and rescuing survivors at their own pace. This shift in design philosophy was a departure from what had made Dead Rising stand out in a crowd of open-world games. Removing the timer system transformed the game into a more standard open-world action-adventure, and while this made the experience less stressful, it also made it far less engaging. The sense of urgency, which had been so integral to the series' identity, was replaced with a more casual, meandering gameplay loop that left many longtime fans unsatisfied. The combo weapon system, which had become a hallmark of the series since Dead Rising 2, returned in Dead Rising 4, but with even more ridiculous and over-the-top creations. Players could once again combine everyday objects to create powerful weapons, such as the candy cane crossbow or a flamethrower made out of Christmas decorations. While these combo weapons were fun to use, they also contributed to the game's overall lack of difficulty. The weapons were so powerful that they often trivialized the combat, making not just the zombies, but all enemies little more than cannon fodder. In addition to the combo weapons, Dead Rising 4 introduced a new mechanic: exosuits. These powerful mechanized suits granted Frank temporary superhuman abilities, allowing him to crush zombies with ease or wield heavy weapons that would normally be inaccessible. The exosuits were undeniably fun to use, but they further contributed to the game's power creep. Where earlier Dead Rising games forced players to think creatively and strategically in combat, Dead Rising 4 made it easy for players to bulldoze their way through the entire experience. While the combo weapons and exosuits were in keeping with the series' tradition of absurdity, they also highlighted the game's tonal inconsistency. The over-the-top combat and goofy weapons clashed with the more serious aspects of the story, creating a disjointed experience that struggled to find a cohesive identity right up until the bitter end. Tonally, Dead Rising 4 was all over the place. While the earlier games had balanced their humor with moments of genuine tension and horror, Dead Rising 4 leaned heavily into the comedic side of the franchise without understanding what made the comedy in the previous games work. The story, which followed Frank West as he uncovered a new government conspiracy related to the zombie outbreak, never took itself seriously, often undercutting dramatic moments with slapstick humor or glib one-liners. While humor had always been a part of the Dead Rising experience, the lack of tonal balance in Dead Rising 4 made the game feel shallow and disconnected from the darker themes it was trying to explore. The game also suffered from a lack of memorable characters. While Frank's return was meant to anchor the story, his drastically changed personality made him less compelling than in previous games. The supporting cast, including new survivors and villains, were largely forgettable, lacking the colorful personalities or unique quirks that had made characters in previous games so memorable. The overall plot felt derivative and undercooked, with few surprises or emotional stakes to keep players invested. While earlier games had featured a strong narrative drive, often tied to the protagonist's personal motivations, Dead Rising 4 felt aimless by comparison. The story unfolded in a series of disconnected missions with little in the way of meaningful character development or plot twists to maintain momentum. And when we finally reach the end of that story in the base game, we are left with an unsatisfying cliffhanger designed specifically to sell the real ending of the game in a DLC chapter titled Frank Rising. Set immediately after the events of Dead Rising 4, Frank Rising follows Frank West as he's found himself infected with the zombie virus. The premise could have been intriguing. Frank, the original zombie-slaying protagonist, had now become one of the undead. This offered the opportunity to explore new gameplay mechanics or add a twist to the narrative. However, Frank Rising quickly proved to be a missed opportunity. While the idea of playing as a zombified Frank could have injected fresh energy into the game, the execution was lackluster. Infected Frank had access to new zombie-like abilities, such as enhanced strength and speed, but these powers were not enough to make the gameplay feel distinct from the rest of the experience. In fact, these mechanics often felt underdeveloped, and the missions in Frank Rising became repetitive, relying on the same formula of fighting through hordes of zombies while completing fetch quests. Narratively, Frank Rising attempted to provide closure to Dead Rising 4's ambiguous ending, where Frank had appeared to perish in the final confrontation. However, the story in Frank Rising felt rushed, with little emotional weight behind Frank's predicament. The idea of Frank West, arguably the most iconic character in the series, being turned into a zombie should have carried significant emotional stakes, but the DLC failed to explore that concept in any meaningful way. The story progressed quickly, with minimal character development or tension, and the conclusion felt anticlimactic. Frank Rising wasn't the satisfying resolution it was pitched as. Instead, it came across as an afterthought, designed to poorly tie up loose ends and make a quick buck in the process. Moreover, Frank Rising continued to suffer from the tonal inconsistencies that had plagued Dead Rising 4. The humor, while present, often clashed with the darker themes of infection and survival. Frank's quips as a zombie felt out of place, and the overall narrative lacked the gravitas needed to make players care about his fate. The DLC had potential, but in the end it felt like a shallow addition to the game that didn't contribute much at all. Speaking of shallow additions, multiplayer had been a significant aspect of Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 3, with cooperative modes allowing players to team up and tackle the campaign together. However, in Dead Rising 4, the co-op experience was relegated to a separate mode, detached from the main story. This was a major downgrade from the fully integrated co-op of the previous games, where players could explore the open world and complete missions together. In Dead Rising 4's multiplayer mode, players worked together in a series of missions, taking on waves of zombies and completing various objectives. While this mode could be fun in short bursts, it lacked the depth and replayability of the campaign co-op from earlier entries. The separation of multiplayer from the main story also made the experience feel disjointed, further detracting from the game's appeal. Dead Rising 4 was understandably met with negative reception. Longtime fans of the series were deeply disappointed by the changes made to the core gameplay. The removal of the timer system, the drastic changes to Frank West's character, and the lack of challenge were all common points of criticism. The game's attempt to modernize the franchise by making it it more accessible to casual players ultimately backfired, alienating the very fanbase that had supported the series from the beginning. For many, Dead Rising 4 represented the franchise at its lowest point. What had once been a unique, tension-filled experience that encouraged creativity and resourcefulness had become a generic, open-world action game. The charm, personality, and challenge that had defined the earlier games was lost, replaced by a game that felt designed by committee, trying to appeal to everyone but satisfying no one. The game's poor reception, combined with lackluster sales, led to the eventual closure of Capcom Vancouver in 2018, effectively putting the series on ice. For many fans, Dead Rising 4 was a sad end to a once great franchise, and its failure highlighted the dangers of straying too far from a series' core identity in the pursuit of broader appeal. As we look back on the Dead Rising series, Dead Rising 4 serves as a reminder of how crucial it is to preserve what makes a franchise special. The original Dead Rising and its first sequel had succeeded because they embraced their quirks and provided players with a unique, challenging, and creative experience. Dead Rising 4's attempts to modernize the series ultimately diluted its identity, leaving fans longing for a true return to the franchise's roots, one which we wouldn't see for many years. The Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, released in late 2024, addresses many of the issues that had become part of the series as it grew. At its most basic, this remaster adheres to the design philosophies that gave the original its unique identity. The inclusion of the timer, staying true to the combat and weapon system, and keeping both the tone and setting unchanged all contribute to an incredibly faithful adaptation. At the start of development, I'm sure there was temptation to bring some newer mechanics back into the game, such as combo weapons, or to make additions to them all, but Capcom showed restraint to the benefit of the player. But that's not to say that the only updates made were graphical, as there were also many small quality-of-life changes that enhanced the overall experience. For example, the timer system now allows players to fast-forward time, giving them the option to skip ahead to new cases or specific events if they prefer. Just to be clear, there is no rewind feature, you can only advance the clock, so the original mechanic of having to manage your time while accomplishing tasks is still fully in place. But now you can save yourself time on repeat playthroughs. There's also the addition of a modernized control scheme, giving new players a way to jump in and immediately feel more familiar with how it feels to control Frank. But for those who want it, the original controls have been preserved and are an option you can select right from the outset. On top of that, you can now move while aiming firearms, although the speed at which you move is slow enough that it doesn't completely change the flow of combat. Another notable change is the item durability bar that gives you a much better read of how long you can continue to use weapons for, allowing you to make more informed decisions about what to use and when to use it, adding just another layer to the pre-existing strategy element. I could keep listing off these improvements, but I think you get my point. However, there were also several changes less positively received, one major one being yet another new voice actor for Frank West. While it would have been nice to see TJ Vertola reprise the role, I don't think this change alone should be enough for anyone to write the game off in its entirety. There have also been a myriad of smaller changes to some character designs and clothing, as well as the removal of the erotica photo category when taking pictures. I'll reiterate, these changes do nothing to alter the core experience of Dead Rising. But if you aren't a fan of the remaster for any reason, Capcom has left the re-release of the original game available for purchase on all storefronts. You can still easily access your preferred version of the game. With all of that said, I believe the Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster is a fantastic starting point for players new to the series, and even as a longtime fan, it's well worth revisiting the game that started it all in a modern way that is more than respectful of the source material. The storytelling, world design, and gameplay mechanics that made the original Dead Rising a standout title are just as compelling today as they were in 2006, and Capcom is only now realizing that the preservation of this blueprint aligns with modern gaming standards better than their ham-fisted attempts to appeal to broader audiences did during the mid-2010s. Games and art as a whole should not be made to appeal to everyone, because that inherently strips both the creators of any personal agency in the creation process, as well as robbing the viewer of their own interpretation of said work. If a game appeals to everyone, then the player's individual experience means nothing. This is why it's so important to not only recognize when a game has certain design principles that appeal to specific audiences, but to promote iterating on that design in future titles rather than watering it down. Truly good game design is timeless, and embracing it was instrumental in helping Dead Rising rise from the dead.
Never give